I never imagined a black mailbox at the edge of my driveway would become the center of a nightmare that lasted almost 6 months. Every week my bills arrived late. Birthday cards disappeared. Important legal documents never showed up. Even prescription medication vanished without a trace. My neighbor acted innocent every time I confronted him. Yet somehow my mailbox was always blocked by his truck, construction trailer, garbage bins, or piles of landscaping equipment whenever the mail carrier came through. The police told me it was a neighborhood dispute. The homeowners association claimed they couldn't prove anything. Friends told me to ignore it and move on. But every missing envelope made the problem bigger, and my neighbor's smirk grew wider. Then, one ordinary Tuesday morning, someone wearing a blue jacket stepped out of an unmarked government vehicle and knocked on his front door. My neighbor laughed at first. 10 minutes later, he wasn't smiling anymore. What happened after that exposed months of lies, hidden camera footage, and one mistake my neighbor never realized he'd made. By the end of that week, our entire neighborhood was standing outside watching justice unfold right in front of our homes. My name is Ethan Brooks, and I'm 34 years old. I work as a project manager for a construction company outside Columbus, Ohio. My wife, Megan, teaches 4th grade at the local elementary school, and together we built the kind of quiet life we'd always wanted. Our neighborhood wasn't fancy, but it was peaceful. Kids rode their bikes after dinner, neighbors waved while walking their dogs, and everyone knew everyone else's first name. At least, that's how it looked from the outside. There was one exception. Our next-door neighbor, Carl Dawson, had lived there longer than anyone else on the street. He acted like the entire block belonged to him. He parked wherever he wanted, dumped yard waste against shared property lines, and argued with anyone who questioned him. People complained behind closed doors, but nobody ever challenged him directly. They all said the same thing. It's easier to let Carl have his way. At first, I thought they were exaggerating. Then my problem started. It began with his pickup truck. Every weekday, around noon, just before the mail carrier usually arrived, Carl's oversized truck somehow ended up parked directly in front of my mailbox. Some days it was his landscaping trailer. Other days it was a pile of mulch, stacks of lumber, or even his garbage bins lined up across the curb. By late afternoon, everything would mysteriously disappear as if nothing had happened. The first time, I assumed it was an accident. The second time, I politely asked him if he could leave a little space so the mail truck could reach my box. He smiled without looking the least bit sorry. "I'll try," he said. He didn't. Over the next few weeks, it became almost routine. I'd come home from work and find no mail at all. The following day, I'd receive 2 or 3 days' worth at once. Megan joked that our mail carrier must have terrible timing, but something about the pattern didn't sit right with me. Then, one Friday afternoon, I checked the mailbox expecting the certified packet my insurance company had promised would arrive before the weekend. The box was empty. When I checked the online tracking number later that evening, my stomach tightened. The package had been marked delivery attempted, mailbox inaccessible. That missing insurance packet wasn't just another piece of mail. It contained documents I needed to renew my homeowner's policy before the deadline. When I called the insurance company Monday morning, the representative confirmed the envelope had been returned to their office after the carrier couldn't safely reach my mailbox. She offered to resend everything, but hearing the words mailbox inaccessible made something click in my mind. This wasn't random. Someone, or something, was making sure my mailbox stayed blocked. Over the next month, the problem only grew worse. My electric bill arrived so late that I paid a penalty for the first time in 12 years. A birthday card from my parents never showed up, even though my mother insisted she'd mailed it a week earlier with a $50 gift card tucked inside. Then Megan's prescription refill was delayed because the pharmacy shipment notification had never reached us. Every missing envelope created another inconvenience, another apology, another phone call explaining that we hadn't ignored our responsibilities. Our regular mail carrier, Linda, finally caught me outside one afternoon. "I'm really sorry," she said, rolling down the window of her mail truck. "If I can't pull up to the mailbox safely, postal regulations don't allow me to stop in the middle of the street." I glanced toward Carl's driveway. His landscaping trailer was sitting exactly where it had been every delivery day that week. "Does this happen often?" I asked. Linda hesitated before answering. More often than it should. That evening, I walked next door again. Carl, I said calmly, your trailer blocked the mailbox again today. He looked up from washing his truck. I forgot it was there. You've forgotten almost every day. He shrugged with an irritating grin. Guess my memory isn't what it used to be. I waited for him to laugh, to admit he was joking. He never did. Instead, he turned the hose back on and ignored me completely. Driving to work the next morning, I bought a small spiral notebook from a gas station. From that day forward, I wrote down everything. Dates, times, photos of his truck, pictures of the trailer, screenshots of missed deliveries, tracking numbers, copies of late notices. Megan thought I was being overly cautious, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't about parking anymore. It felt deliberate, and if it really was deliberate, I wanted proof before anyone dismissed me as another neighbor complaining about Carl Dawson. I had no idea those notes would eventually become the foundation of everything that followed. By the time I'd filled half the notebook, I stopped believing Carl's excuses. Every blocked delivery followed the same pattern. Just before noon, something appeared in front of my mailbox. By evening, it was gone. It was too consistent to be coincidence. I decided to report the problem to our homeowners association. The HOA president, Linda Foster, invited me to the monthly board meeting. I brought my notebook, printed photos, and copies of the late notices I'd received. I laid everything on the conference table and explained exactly what had been happening for nearly 2 months. Everyone listened politely. When I finished, Linda sighed. We've received complaints about Carl before. That caught my attention. For this, she shook her head. For parking, noise, property lines, arguments. But unless we witness a violation ourselves, there's only so much we can enforce. So, when nothing happens, we'll send another reminder. Another reminder. Carl had apparently collected those like junk mail. Unsatisfied, I drove to the local police station the following afternoon. The officer at the front desk listened patiently while scrolling through the photos on my phone. I understand why you're frustrated, he said, but this is mainly a neighborhood dispute. If he's blocking access temporarily and moves the vehicle later, there's not much we can do unless another law is clearly being broken. So I just wait. I'm saying document everything. The answer sounded familiar. Everyone wanted documentation. Nobody wanted confrontation. That weekend, Megan and I attended a neighborhood barbecue. I wasn't planning to bring up Carl, but one of our older neighbors quietly pulled me aside after overhearing someone mention the mailbox. You having trouble with him too? He asked. You know about it? He nodded. My packages disappeared twice a few years back after I argued with Carl over a fence. Never proved anything. Another neighbor joined us. He parked his boat in front of our mailbox for almost 3 weeks, she admitted. We finally gave up and rented a post office box. As the conversation continued, story after story surfaced. Blocked driveways, property damage, harassment, threats. Every family had experienced something. Every family had backed down. Carl had built his reputation one unanswered incident at a time, until people accepted his behavior as the cost of living on our street. Driving home that evening, I realized something that bothered me even more than the missing mail. Carl wasn't getting away with it because he was clever. He was getting away with it because everyone expected someone else to stop him. The next morning, I opened my informed delivery email from the Postal Service. A certified letter from my mortgage company was scheduled to arrive that afternoon. When I checked the mailbox after work, it wasn't there. The missing mortgage letter was the moment I stopped reacting and started planning. Fortunately, my company had just finished a large commercial project, and my supervisor approved my request to work from home for a couple of weeks while we prepared bids for upcoming contracts. It gave me something I hadn't had since this whole mess started. Time. Every morning, I set my laptop on the dining room table where I had a clear view through the front window. My work occupied most of my attention, but every few minutes I'd glance toward the street. Carl followed a routine almost as predictable as the sunrise. Around 11:30, he'd step outside with a cup of coffee, look both ways down the road, then move something in front of my mailbox. Monday, it was his pickup. Tuesday, it was 2 oversized trash bins. Wednesday, a flatbed trailer. Thursday, stacks of landscaping stones. By 1 o'clock, everything would be back where it belonged, almost like clockwork. Friday finally gave me the confirmation I'd been waiting for. At exactly 12:08, Linda's postal truck turned onto our street. She slowed as she approached my mailbox, then stopped several feet away. Carl's trailer completely blocked the curb. Linda sat there for a few seconds, clearly hoping someone would move it. Nobody did. She marked something on the handheld scanner beside her seat, pulled back into traffic, and continued to the next house. Less than 2 minutes later, Carl walked outside. Without looking around, he climbed into his truck, backed the trailer into his driveway, and calmly returned inside. He hadn't forgotten. He'd waited until the mail truck left. I replayed the scene in my head all afternoon. The timing was too perfect, too deliberate. That evening, I showed Megan everything I'd seen. She folded her arms and stared through the front window. "He's doing it on purpose," she whispered. "I know. So what now? I'll make sure nobody can say it's my word against his." The next morning, I drove to an electronics store before breakfast. An hour later, I was standing on a ladder installing 2 weatherproof security cameras. One overlooked the driveway and mailbox from beneath the garage roof. The other faced the street from the corner of the porch, wide enough to capture every vehicle passing our house. Both recorded continuously and stored footage in the cloud. Carl watched from his yard the entire time. He smiled. He probably thought I was wasting my money. I smiled back. For the first time in months, I felt like the advantage had quietly shifted in my favor. The cameras went unnoticed for the first few days. Or at least Carl pretended they had. Every morning, I checked the recordings before logging into work, expecting to catch him repeating the same routine. Instead, the footage showed nothing unusual. His truck stayed in the driveway. The mailbox remained clear. Linda drove up, dropped off our mail, and continued down the street without slowing. It almost made me question myself. Maybe the cameras alone had solved the problem. Maybe Carl had finally realized someone was paying attention. By the end of the week, I started thinking about taking them down. Then Monday arrived. At 11:42 a.m., my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the camera overlooking the mailbox. I opened the live feed. Carl was walking across his yard wearing work gloves and dragging 2 large green garbage bins behind him. He didn't stop at his own curb. Instead, he pulled both bins directly in front of my mailbox, looked briefly toward my house, then calmly walked back across his lawn. I checked the clock. 11:44. Linda usually reached our street between noon and 12:15. I hit the record button on my phone, even though the footage was already being saved automatically. At exactly 12:09, the familiar white postal truck appeared. Linda slowed as she approached. She leaned forward, clearly trying to judge whether there was enough room to reach the mailbox safely. There wasn't. After waiting several seconds, she entered something into her handheld scanner and drove away. I kept watching. Less than 3 minutes later, Carl stepped outside again. Without any hesitation, he grabbed both garbage bins and rolled them back beside his garage. Then he stood in his driveway, sipping coffee as though he'd just completed another ordinary household chore. I replayed the footage 5 times. There was no innocent explanation anymore. No accident. No forgotten trash day. The entire sequence had lasted barely 6 minutes. Block the mailbox. Wait for the mail truck to leave. Move everything back. That evening, I downloaded the video onto my computer and saved 3 backup copies. 1 on an external hard drive. 1 in cloud storage. 1 on a flash drive locked inside my desk drawer. When Megan watched the recording after dinner, she covered her mouth in disbelief. "He actually planned it," she whispered. "I think he's been planning it for months." For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't relying on suspicion. I had clear video showing exactly what had happened. But as satisfying as that felt, I couldn't shake one thought. If Carl had been willing to do this on camera, what else had he been doing whenever nobody was watching? After saving the footage, I stopped looking at Carl's behavior as a series of isolated incidents. Instead, I treated it like a project at work. Every event had a date, a time, a cause, and an effect. If I could connect them all, the pattern would speak for itself. I spread everything across my dining room table. The notebook, printed photographs, delivery tracking numbers, late payment notices, Screenshots from the Postal Service's informed delivery emails. The new camera footage. For nearly 3 hours, I organized every document into chronological order. The timeline stretched back almost 5 months. The results surprised even me. Every missed delivery matched a day when something had blocked access to the mailbox. Every late bill followed one of those blocked deliveries. Even packages marked delivery attempted lined up perfectly with photos showing Carl's truck, trailer, or garbage bins sitting exactly where they shouldn't have been. It wasn't bad luck. It was a repeated pattern. As I compared everything, another detail caught my attention. 3 different envelopes had been sent by certified mail. The insurance documents, the mortgage notice, and a property tax assessment from the county. Each one had failed delivery because the mailbox was listed as inaccessible. Those weren't ordinary letters. They were time-sensitive documents with legal deadlines attached. I opened my laptop and started researching postal regulations. Within minutes, I realized I'd been looking at the situation the wrong way. This wasn't simply about an inconsiderate neighbor. Federal law takes interference with mail delivery seriously. I wasn't reading sensational articles or neighborhood forums. I was reading official guidance explaining that intentionally obstructing mail delivery could trigger an investigation by the United States Postal Inspection Service. I leaned back in my chair. For the first time, this felt bigger than our neighborhood. Much bigger. That evening, I added another folder to my computer labeled Evidence Timeline. Inside it, I organized everything by month, naming every file with the exact date and time. If anyone reviewed it later, they wouldn't have to guess what happened. The story would unfold on its own. Before shutting down for the night, I checked the security cameras one last time. Carl was standing in his driveway talking with another neighbor. He laughed, pointed toward my house, then shook his head as if I were the unreasonable one. I couldn't hear a single word. I didn't need to. For months, he controlled the narrative because nobody had proof. Now the evidence was beginning to tell a very different story, and something told me that story was only getting started. The next morning, I decided it was time to stop relying only on cameras and paperwork. If anyone understood what had been happening on our street, it was Linda. She had driven the same route for years, and she'd witnessed every blocked delivery firsthand. I waited near the mailbox just before noon. When the familiar white postal truck turned onto our street, the mailbox was finally clear. Linda pulled alongside the curb, handed me a small stack of envelopes, then smiled. "Everything okay today? I was actually hoping to ask you something." She glanced at the houses behind me before switching off the engine. "Go ahead." I took a slow breath. Has my mailbox really been marked inaccessible all those times? Her expression turned serious. More times than I can count. It isn't just me imagining this. She shook her head. No. I told her about the security footage, the notebook, the missing certified mail, the timeline I'd built. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she nodded quietly. I've been expecting someone to start keeping records. That answer caught me off guard. You have. Linda looked down the street toward Carl's house. Your address isn't the first. What do you mean? I'm careful about what I say, but access problems involving that property have been documented before. Different neighbors. Different years. So people complained? They did. And they eventually gave up. I frowned. Why? Most people don't realize there's a difference between being annoyed and creating an official record. Complaints fade. Documentation doesn't. She reached into the truck and tapped the handheld scanner she used every day. Every time I can't safely reach your mailbox, this device records exactly why delivery couldn't be completed. I stared at the scanner. So every blocked delivery has a timestamp. She paused before continuing. And those reports don't just disappear. I felt my pulse quicken. I never knew that. Most people don't. She handed me my last envelope. I can't discuss internal procedures, but I can tell you this. If someone intentionally keeps preventing mail from being delivered, she chose her next words carefully. Eventually, the right people notice. I watched her drive to the next house, replaying that sentence in my head. Eventually, the right people notice. That afternoon, I compared Linda's delivery times with my security footage. Every timestamp matched, minute for minute, day after day. 5 months of camera recordings now lined up perfectly with the Postal Service's documented delivery attempts. It was no longer just my evidence. Two independent timelines were telling exactly the same story. For the first time, I believed someone outside our neighborhood might actually listen. I just didn't know how soon that would happen. Once I realized my evidence matched the Postal Service's records, I stopped thinking emotionally. I stopped confronting Carl, stopped knocking on his door, stopped reacting every time he smiled across the property line. Instead, I became patient. If he'd managed to fool everyone else for years, I wasn't going to ruin my chance by arguing with him now. For almost 2 weeks, I acted like I'd accepted defeat. I waved whenever I saw him. I mowed my lawn. I worked in the garage. I even thanked him one afternoon when he moved his truck after the mail had already come. His confidence grew with every passing day. You could see it in the way he carried himself. The cameras no longer seemed to concern him. If anything, he behaved as though they'd become part of the scenery. Then, on a rainy Wednesday, he made the mistake that changed everything. At 11:57 a.m., my phone alerted me to motion near the mailbox. I opened a live feed, expecting another pair of garbage bins. Instead, Carl walked directly to my mailbox. He looked both ways down the street. No one appeared to be outside. Believing he was alone, he reached toward the front of my mailbox and tugged at it. The door opened. He leaned in for only a second. Not long enough to remove anything that I could clearly see, but long enough that he had absolutely no reason to be touching it. Then he quietly closed the mailbox, stepped away, and rolled his trailer into position across the curb exactly as he'd done so many times before. The mail truck arrived 12 minutes later. Linda couldn't reach the box. Another delivery attempt failed. As soon as she drove away, Carl pulled the trailer back into his driveway. The entire sequence had been recorded from 2 separate camera angles. I watched it several times that evening. Whether he'd checked for mail, tried to look inside, or simply wanted to make sure the box was empty, I couldn't honestly say. I wasn't going to make assumptions. The video only showed what it showed, and what it showed was enough. He had approached property that wasn't his, manipulated my mailbox without permission, and immediately blocked access before the carrier arrived. That night, I finished organizing every photograph, delivery record, and video clip into a single digital folder. I added written summaries explaining each incident in chronological order. The next morning, I submitted the complete package through the appropriate Postal Service reporting channels. Then I waited. For the first time since this all began, there was nothing more for me to do. The evidence would have to speak for itself. Submitting the evidence should have felt like a victory. Instead, it felt like stepping into silence. The confirmation email arrived within minutes, stating only that my report had been received and would be reviewed. There was no timeline, no promise of action, no indication that anyone had even watched the videos. After months of documenting every incident, all I had was an automated message and a folder full of evidence sitting on my computer. Life settled into an uneasy routine. Every morning, I checked my email before work. Nothing. Every afternoon, I reviewed the security cameras. Carl was still playing the same game. Some days it was his truck. Other days, it was the trailer or garbage bins. Whenever the mail truck approached, access somehow became impossible. Then, almost magically, everything disappeared minutes later. It was as if he believed he was untouchable. Maybe he did. A week passed. Then another. I caught myself wondering if I'd wasted my time. Megan noticed the frustration before I admitted it. "You're checking those cameras every hour," she said one evening. "I just keep thinking someone should have contacted us by now." She placed a hand on my shoulder. "You did everything you could. Now let them do their job." I nodded, but patience wasn't easy, especially when Carl seemed happier than ever. One Saturday morning, I looked outside and saw him chatting with 2 neighbors while washing his pickup. He laughed loudly, glanced toward our house, and gave me a little wave with the sponge in his hand. It wasn't a friendly wave. It was the kind that said he thought he'd already won. I simply nodded and went back inside. There was no point giving him the reaction he wanted. Monday came. Nothing. Tuesday looked exactly the same. Then Wednesday morning arrived. At 10:38, while I was reviewing construction estimates on my laptop, an unfamiliar vehicle turned slowly onto our street. It wasn't a police cruiser. It wasn't a delivery van. It was a dark blue SUV with no company logo and government license plates. The driver parked halfway between my house and Carl's, stepped out carrying a slim black folder, and spent nearly a minute quietly studying the row of mailboxes before saying a word to anyone. Something about the calm confidence in the way he moved made my pulse quicken. He wasn't lost. He wasn't selling anything. He had come for a reason. I watched from the front window as he adjusted his blue jacket, looked once more at my mailbox, and started walking toward my front door. I opened the front door before the man had a chance to knock. He offered a polite smile and held up a leather credential wallet. "Good morning. I'm Daniel Mercer with the United States Postal Inspection Service." My heartbeat instantly sped up. "So, someone actually reviewed my report?" "We did." His voice was calm and professional. "And we'd like to ask you a few questions if you have a few minutes." I invited him inside. Rather than sitting down immediately, Inspector Mercer walked to the front window and looked toward the mailbox. "That's the location mentioned in your submission?" "Yes." He made a brief note inside the folder before turning back to me. "I've already spoken with your regular letter carrier this morning." "Linda." He nodded. She confirmed several documented access issues involving this address over an extended period. For the next 20 minutes, he asked precise, methodical questions. "When did you first notice the obstruction? Did you ever move your mailbox? Have you personally confronted your neighbor? Are these video files stored in their original format?" There wasn't a single dramatic moment. No accusations. No assumptions. Just careful fact-finding. I appreciated that. When I handed him the external hard drive containing every video, photograph, and written timeline, he didn't rush through it. Instead, he verified file dates, compared timestamps with printed delivery records, and occasionally asked me to clarify small details. Everything felt deliberate. Before leaving my kitchen table, he closed the folder and looked directly at me. "You've organized this exceptionally well. I wasn't sure anyone would actually look at it. We look at everything that's properly documented." Those words alone made the last several months feel worthwhile. Outside, Inspector Mercer didn't head straight for his vehicle. Instead, he walked with measured steps toward the curb where my mailbox stood. He crouched beside it, examining the distance between the post and the edge of the road. He measured the available space with a compact measuring tape before taking several photographs from different angles. Then he slowly followed the mail carrier's route, stopping at neighboring mailboxes to compare access points. Nothing about his movements suggested haste. He was reconstructing exactly what happened during every failed delivery. When he finished, he thanked me again and walked across the street. My pulse quickened. Carl was washing his truck, humming to himself as if it were any other Wednesday. He looked up, spotted the inspector approaching, and flashed the same confident grin I'd seen for months. He had no idea the conversation about to begin wasn't another neighborhood argument. It was the first official knock he'd never expected to answer. Carl set the hose down and wiped his hands on a towel as Inspector Mercer stepped into the driveway. I couldn't hear their first few words from inside my house, but I could tell Carl wasn't taking the conversation seriously. He leaned casually against his truck, smiled, and even laughed once while pointing toward my property. Then Inspector Mercer opened the black folder. Everything changed. Carl's smile faded almost immediately. The inspector removed several printed photographs and held them where Carl could see them. Even from across the street, I recognized the images. They were still frames taken from my security cameras, each one stamped with the exact date and time. Carl folded his arms. He spoke for nearly a minute, shaking his head as though dismissing the entire thing as a misunderstanding. Inspector Mercer listened without interrupting. When Carl finished, the inspector calmly produced another document. This one wasn't for me. I watched Carl lean forward to read it. His expression tightened. Inspector Mercer pointed toward my mailbox, then toward the roadway, explaining something with measured, deliberate gestures. He wasn't arguing. He was walking Carl through documented facts. Carl responded by waving both hands dramatically, pointing toward his trailer, then toward the curb, clearly insisting he had done nothing wrong. The inspector quietly turned another page, then another. Each document seemed to erase another excuse before Carl could finish explaining it. A few minutes later, a second vehicle pulled onto our street. This one carried the familiar Postal Service logo. Linda stepped out alongside another postal employee carrying a small tablet. They greeted Inspector Mercer before walking directly to the mailbox. Carl looked around the neighborhood for the first time. Several curtains had moved. Front doors cracked open. People pretending to water flowers suddenly found reasons to stay outside. Nobody said a word. Everyone was watching. Inspector Mercer compared the printed records in his folder with information displayed on the tablet, while Linda answered several questions. The entire conversation remained calm, professional, methodical. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, just facts replacing excuses one by one. Carl's confidence continued slipping away. His shoulders lowered. His answers became shorter. He stopped pointing, stopped smiling, stopped trying to control the conversation. When Inspector Mercer finally closed the folder, he handed Carl a business card and spoke quietly for several seconds. Carl didn't respond immediately. He simply stared at the card in his hand. As the inspector turned to leave, Carl glanced toward my house. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, the expression on his face wasn't smug. It was uncertainty, and deep down, I knew something important had shifted. The man who believed nobody could stop him had finally met someone who relied only on evidence, records, and the truth. After Inspector Mercer left, the neighborhood felt strangely quiet. Carl didn't finish washing his truck. Instead, he backed it into the garage and closed the door, something I'd never seen him do in the middle of the afternoon. The usual confidence he displayed for months had disappeared behind a steel garage door. For the next several days, nothing happened. At least, nothing visible. The mailbox remained clear every single afternoon. No truck, no trailer, no garbage bins. Linda pulled up without slowing, delivered our mail, and continued down the street exactly the way she should have all along. Then, late Friday morning, another government vehicle stopped outside Carl's house. This time, nobody pretended not to notice. Neighbors glanced through windows. Dog walkers slowed their pace. Even the kids riding bicycles quietly watched from the end of the block. Inspector Mercer returned with another postal official carrying a thick file. Carl stepped outside before they reached the porch. His posture suggested he had rehearsed what he wanted to say. The conversation lasted much longer than the first one. Although I couldn't hear the words, I recognized several documents as they were spread across the hood of the inspector's vehicle. Delivery records, photographs, printed still images from my cameras. The officials compared dates one by one. Carl occasionally pointed toward the street or shrugged, but every explanation seemed to lead to another page of documentation. After nearly 30 minutes, Inspector Mercer asked him to sign acknowledging receipt of several official documents. Carl hesitated. Then he signed. As the inspectors walked back toward their vehicle, they stopped briefly to speak with Linda, who had just finished delivering mail farther down the street. She handed them additional delivery logs from her scanner before continuing her route. Everything fit together. My videos, Linda's delivery records, the timestamps, the photographs. Each piece supported the next. There wasn't one dramatic piece of evidence. There were dozens of small facts telling the same story. Later that afternoon, our HOA president knocked on my door. Linda Foster looked almost embarrassed. "We've been informed that this matter involved much more than a neighborhood disagreement," she admitted. She explained the association would begin reviewing several complaints that had previously been dismissed because new information suggested a repeated pattern of conduct rather than isolated incidents. I simply thanked her. I wasn't interested in saying, "I told you so." The evidence had already done that far better than I ever could. Standing in my front window that evening, I watched Linda's mail truck stop perfectly beside my mailbox once again. For the first time in months, there were no obstacles. Just an open curb, a routine delivery, and the unmistakable feeling that the truth had finally become impossible to ignore. The following week, something changed that I hadn't expected. It wasn't Carl. It was everyone else. For years, our neighborhood had operated on an unspoken rule. If Carl caused trouble, people avoided him and hoped he'd bother someone else next. That silence had protected him far more effectively than any excuse ever could. Now the silence was breaking. It started with Mr. Henderson from 3 houses down. While I was mowing the lawn one Saturday morning, he walked across the street carrying a warm manila folder. "I've been holding on to these for years," he said. Inside were photographs of Carl's boat blocking his mailbox, copies of certified mail notices, and handwritten notes with dates stretching back almost 4 years. I figured nobody would ever care. "They do now," I replied. The next afternoon, another neighbor stopped by, then another. Within days, half a dozen families had shared nearly identical stories. One couple described missing legal documents during a property refinance. Another neighbor recalled prescription deliveries being delayed because the mail carrier couldn't safely stop. An elderly widow quietly admitted she'd switched to a post office box after repeated delivery problems left her worried about important medical correspondence. Listening to them, I realized my situation had never been unique. It had simply been the first one backed by undeniable evidence. Several neighbors agreed to provide written statements describing what they had experienced over the years. Nobody exaggerated. Nobody guessed. Everyone focused on facts they had personally witnessed. The atmosphere on our street slowly began changing. People who had barely spoken before now stood together outside in the evenings, comparing timelines and encouraging one another. Carl noticed. He stopped spending long afternoons in his driveway. The loud music disappeared. His truck remained neatly parked behind the garage instead of along the curb. Even his usual habit of glaring at anyone walking past seemed to fade. One evening, as Megan and I watered the flowers near our porch, she looked around the street and smiled. "It's different now." "It is. People aren't afraid anymore." She was right. The fear hadn't disappeared overnight. It had simply been replaced by something stronger. Confidence. Not because anyone wanted revenge, because they finally understood that standing together was far more powerful than facing intimidation alone. As the sun set behind the row of maple trees, I looked toward my mailbox. Linda's delivery had arrived hours earlier without a single problem. For months, that simple sight had felt impossible. Now it felt normal again. And somehow, normal was the most satisfying victory of all. About 2 weeks after the inspector's second visit, the outcome everyone had been wondering about finally became impossible to ignore. Early Monday morning, I looked out the front window and noticed a moving truck parked in Carl's driveway. Not the oversized landscaping trailer that had blocked my mailbox so many times. An actual moving truck. 2 workers carried boxes from the garage while Carl stood nearby, speaking quietly on his phone. There was no shouting, no dramatic scene, no crowd gathering around his house. Just a man whose routine had completely changed. Around lunchtime, Linda stopped at our mailbox as usual. She smiled when she handed me the day's mail. "Looks like you won't have any access problems today." "I don't think I will." She glanced toward Carl's house for only a second before continuing her route. By the end of the week, the landscaping trailer was gone. The piles of lumber disappeared. The curb in front of my mailbox remained completely clear every single day. A few days later, the Homeowners Association sent every resident an email announcing updated community parking and curb access guidelines. The message reminded homeowners to keep public access areas clear, especially around mailboxes and utility access points, and explained that repeated violations could result in formal enforcement measures. Several neighbors later told me they had also been contacted regarding older complaints that were now being reviewed alongside newer information. For the first time, people believed their concerns would actually be taken seriously. One evening, Mr. Henderson walked over while I was bringing the trash bins inside. "You know," he said with a grin, "I've lived here 18 years. I laughed. "And this is the first time I've ever seen that curb empty for an entire month." We both looked toward the mailbox. It seemed strange that something so ordinary could feel so significant. A place that had once caused daily frustration now blended naturally into the neighborhood again. Life became wonderfully predictable. Bills arrived on time. Birthday cards showed up exactly when they should. Packages were delivered without delay. Even the mail carrier seemed more relaxed now that she no longer had to hesitate before reaching our house. Looking back, I realized the biggest consequence wasn't what happened to Carl. It was what happened to everyone else. People stopped believing they had to tolerate intimidation simply because it had gone on for years. Sometimes real change doesn't begin with a dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it begins with one person quietly documenting the truth, staying patient, and allowing facts, not anger, to do the talking. That lesson stayed with me long after the mailbox stopped being the center of our street. Nearly 6 months after that first missed insurance packet, life finally felt ordinary again. Every afternoon, I heard the familiar sound of Linda's mail truck slowing in front of our house. She'd pull alongside the curb, slide open a mailbox, leave our letters, and continue down the street without ever touching the brake twice. It had become so routine that sometimes I didn't even look out the window anymore. That was the best part. The mailbox had stopped being something I worried about. One evening, Megan and I sat on the front porch watching the neighborhood kids ride their bikes in circles around the cul-de-sac. Mr. Henderson walked by with his golden retriever and waved. A few houses down, neighbors chatted while watering their flowers. Everything felt peaceful again, not because our street had become perfect, but because people no longer believed they had to stay silent when something wasn't right. Months earlier, I thought this story was about a blocked mailbox. I was wrong. It was really about what happens when small problems are ignored long enough that they start feeling normal. Carl counted on that. He expected everyone to keep looking the other way. Instead, patience, careful documentation, and simple facts accomplished what arguments never could. I never celebrated what happened to him. I never wanted revenge. I only wanted my mail delivered the same way everyone else's was. Looking back now, I'm grateful I didn't lose my temper during those long months. If I had, this story might have ended very differently. Instead, I learned that the strongest response isn't always the loudest one. Sometimes it's quietly collecting the truth until it becomes impossible to deny. Now, whenever I hear the mailbox door close each afternoon, I don't think about frustration anymore. I think about peace. Because after months of waiting, worrying, and wondering if anyone would listen, that simple sound reminds me that truth has a way of arriving, sometimes a little later than we'd like, but always worth waiting for.